The heavy wooden gavel fell, its sharp crack barely cutting through the chorus of mocking laughter, echoing off the mahogany walls of courtroom 3B. Alistair Galt, a high-priced attorney in a bespoke Italian suit, openly chuckled, while the ex-husband, Roberto, smirked, whispering into the ear of his diamond-draped fiancée. They thought they had just ruined her. They believed the woman sitting quietly in the faded beige trench coat was a helpless, penniless housewife walking away with absolute nothing. They were entirely wrong. As the laughter swelled, Cerise Delgado simply adjusted her collar, a cold, predatory smile finally touching her lips. The trap had just snapped shut. The air inside the Cook County family court was stale, smelling of floor wax and shattered promises. The Honorable Thomas Harrison peered over his reading glasses, his expression a mixture of fatigue and mild pity as he looked at the plaintiff, Cerise Delgado. "Mrs. Scott," Judge Harrison began, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "Or I suppose Miss Delgado now. Are you absolutely certain you understand the terms of this settlement? You are waiving your right to ongoing spousal support. You are accepting a one-time lump sum of $50,000, the 2008 Honda Accord, and waiving all claims to Mr. Scott's business assets, his investment portfolios, and the primary residence in Winnetka. In exchange, Mr. Scott is waiving any claim to your personal assets, known or unknown. This is an absolute, clean break settlement." Before Cerise could open her mouth, Alistair Galt, Roberto's ruthless bulldog of an attorney, stood up, buttoning his $1,000 suit jacket. "Your Honor, my client is being more than generous. For the past 6 years, Mr. Scott has been the sole breadwinner. He built Scott Financial Partners from the ground up, working 80-hour weeks while Ms. Delgado—" Alistair paused, letting a condescending smile touch his lips. "Tended to her domestic hobbies. She contributed nothing to the financial growth of the estate. The $50,000 is a courtesy, a severance package for a marriage she slept through." In the gallery, a soft, musical giggle erupted. It came from Chloe Kensington, Roberto's new fiancée. She was 26, a former marketing assistant, who wore her newly acquired wealth like a neon sign. Today, she was draped in a tailored Chanel blazer, a massive 3-carat princess-cut diamond glinting on her left hand, a ring Roberto had purchased while still legally married to Cerise. Roberto sat beside his lawyer, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed posture of a victor. He was undeniably handsome, with silver-tipped hair and the polished veneer of a man who sold financial dreams to wealthy retirees. He looked at Cerise with a mixture of relief and utter disdain. To him, Cerise was an anchor he had finally managed to cut loose. She was dressed in a simple, off-the-rack navy skirt and a beige trench coat that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, unassuming bun. She looked every inch the defeated, discarded first wife. "Is that your understanding, Miss Delgado?" the judge pressed, furrowing his brow. "Your own counsel has advised against this." Cerise's attorney, an older, rumpled man named Arthur Pendleton, sighed heavily and looked down at his legal pad. He had spent the last 3 months begging Cerise to fight for a percentage of Roberto's firm, or at least the equity in the $4 million marital home. Cerise had rigidly refused. Cerise stood up. Her voice was quiet, steady, and entirely devoid of the tears Roberto expected. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand the terms perfectly. I accept the $50,000, and I insist on the mutual waiver of all undisclosed and future assets." A clean break. Roberto leaned over to Alistair and whispered loud enough for the court reporter to hear, "She's taking the pennies because she knows she'd get destroyed in a forensic audit. She hasn't worked a real job since 2018. Alistair chuckled darkly. She's terrified, Roberto. Let her take her little payout and run back to Ohio. Very well, Judge Harrison said, bringing the gavel down with a heavy thud. The decree of divorce is granted. Judgment entered as to the property settlement. We are adjourned. The moment the judge disappeared into his chambers, the tension in the room broke into an ugly, celebratory cacophony. Roberto immediately stood, pulled Chloe into his arms, and kissed her deeply, right in front of the plaintiff's table. Congratulations, darling, Chloe purred, her eyes darting over Roberto's shoulder to lock on to Cerise. You're finally free of the dead weight. Alistair Galt began packing his premium leather briefcase, shaking his head. He looked over at Arthur Pendleton. Better luck next time, Artie. Maybe next time you'll find a client who actually understands how the real world works. 50 grand won't even cover a year's rent in a decent zip code. Cerise quietly gathered her purse. She didn't look angry. She didn't look devastated. If anything, her calm demeanor seemed to agitate Roberto. He walked over to her table, leaning his knuckles on the polished wood. 50,000, Cerise, Roberto sneered, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I made 3 million last year alone. You could have fought, but you were always weak. You never had the stomach for the big leagues. Have fun in your rusted Honda. Don't bother calling when the money runs out. Cerise looked up at him. Her green eyes, usually warm and forgiving during their early years, were entirely dead to him now. I won't call, Roberto. Just make sure you read the waiver you signed. Mutual release of all assets, known, unknown, offshore, or held in proxy. Roberto laughed out loud. I insisted on that clause, Cerise. Did you think I was stupid? I know you were trying to snoop into my Cayman accounts. Now you can't touch a dime of my real money. You played yourself. Cerise simply nodded. Goodbye, Roberto. As she walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, Roberto, Chloe, and Alistair burst into genuine raucous laughter. The sound echoed off the marble walls, following her all the way to the heavy oak doors. They were laughing at her. They were laughing at the poor, naive ex-wife who had just signed away her financial future. They had no idea that Cerise Delgado had just orchestrated the most spectacular financial coup of the decade. The truth about Cerise Delgado was a ghost story, whispered only in the highest echelons of global private equity. And even then, she was known only as the apex beneficiary. To understand how a woman worth nearly $4 billion ended up being laughed out of a Chicago courtroom in a beige trench coat, one had to look back exactly 5 years. When Cerise and Roberto first married, she was a mid-level data analyst, and he was an ambitious junior broker. They were in love, or at least Cerise thought they were. But as Roberto climbed the corporate ladder, his ego inflated to monstrous proportions. He began treating Cerise less like a partner and more like an inconvenient accessory. Then came the turning point. Cerise's maternal grandfather, an eccentric, reclusive man named Theodore Blackwood, passed away. Roberto barely attended the funeral, writing the old man off as a penniless hoarder. What Roberto didn't know, and what Cerise deliberately hid when she discovered her husband's first string of infidelities a month later, was that Theodore Blackwood wasn't a hoarder. He was an early pioneer in semiconductor patents. He had left Cerise a maze of shell companies, an obscure trust fund, and a portfolio of technological patents that were suddenly becoming critical to the explosive growth of artificial intelligence. Broken by Roberto's cheating, but unwilling to confront a man she knew would drag her through a brutal, mud-slinging divorce just to steal her inheritance, Cerise made a choice. She played the long game. She stayed in the marriage, playing the role of the quiet, slightly depressed housewife. She told Roberto her grandfather had left her a few $1,000s, which she used to day trade from her laptop in the guest bedroom. In reality, from that guest bedroom, Cerise built an empire. She hired a ruthless, elite wealth management firm based in Geneva. She rolled the patents into a holding company called Axiom Global Partners, registered in Delaware as a C Corp to obscure her ownership. Axiom began licensing the tech to major Silicon Valley giants. The royalties were astronomical. Within 3 years, Axiom had evolved into a massive venture capital and acquisition firm, buying up distressed tech and financial assets across the globe. Cerise's net worth skyrocketed from a few million to over $3 billion. She bought real estate in Manhattan, London, and Tokyo under corporate LLCs. She commanded board meetings via encrypted audio calls, using her maiden name and a voice-altering software to maintain absolute anonymity as the company's chairman. Meanwhile, Roberto's financial reality was a carefully constructed house of cards. He loved the appearance of wealth. He leased the Porsche 911. He took out an aggressive secondary mortgage on the Winnetka house to fund his lavish client dinners and his secret trysts with Chloe. Scott Financial Partners, despite Roberto's boasting, was deeply over-leveraged. He had made terrible bets on commercial real estate just before the market took a massive hit. Roberto wasn't rich. He was drowning in high-interest debt, desperately trying to project success to attract a larger firm to buy him out and save him from bankruptcy. Cerise knew all of this. She had hired a private intelligence firm to audit Roberto's entire life 2 years ago. That was why she engineered the divorce exactly the way she did. She knew Roberto was hiding massive debts and perhaps a few meager illegal offshore accounts to avoid taxes. She instructed her seemingly bumbling attorney, Arthur Pendleton, to drop hints that Cerise was suspicious of Roberto's hidden money. Roberto, terrified that a deep dive into his finances during the divorce discovery phase would reveal his firm's insolvency and his own fraudulent accounting, panicked. He instructed his attack dog, Alistair Galt, to push for a fast, dirty divorce with a strict, mutual waiver of undisclosed assets. Roberto thought he was protecting his fragile financial ego and his hidden offshore pennies from Cerise. By aggressively demanding that neither party could ever lay claim to any asset not explicitly listed in the divorce decree, Roberto legally, permanently, and enthusiastically signed away his marital right to Cerise's $3 billion empire. He locked the door from the outside and handed her the key. Stepping out of the Cook County courthouse into the biting Chicago wind, Cerise didn't walk toward the rusted 2008 Honda Accord she had officially won in the settlement. She walked 3 blocks down to a private underground parking garage beneath the Willis Tower. As she descended into the VIP section, a sleek, custom black Maybach S-Class flashed its headlights. A towering man in a dark chauffeur's uniform immediately opened the rear door. "Good afternoon, Ms. Delgado," the driver said respectfully. "Thank you, David," Cerise replied, shedding the cheap beige trench coat and tossing it into a nearby trash can. Underneath, she wore a sharply tailored charcoal grey Tom Ford blazer. Sitting in the plush leather seat, she opened the privacy partition. Waiting for her inside, the car was a sharply dressed woman with a tablet, Eleanor Croft, her actual attorney, and the chief operating officer of Axiom Global Partners. Arthur Pendleton had just been a hired actor for the local courtroom theatre. Eleanor handed Cerise a crystal glass of sparkling water. "It is done." "Signed, sealed, and entered into the court record," Cerise said, a genuine, relaxed smile finally crossing her face. Roberto insisted on the absolute waiver. The judge granted it. "I am completely decoupled from him, and he has zero legal recourse to Axiom or any of its subsidiaries." Eleanor scrolled through her tablet, a predatory gleam in her eye. Excellent. Because we have a pressing matter regarding your ex-husband's firm. Scott Financial is completely out of runway. Our analysts show they will default on their commercial loans by the end of the month. Cerise took a sip of water, looking out the tinted windows as the Maybach merged onto the highway. I know. Roberto is banking his entire survival on an acquisition. He's trying to sell his firm. Yes, Eleanor nodded. To us. Scott's broker has been aggressively pitching an acquisition to Axiom Global for the past 3 weeks. Roberto believes Axiom is a massive, faceless conglomerate that will buy his firm, clear his debts, and give him a $10 million executive payout just to acquire his client list. Cerise's smile widened, sharp and dangerous. Let him believe it. Set up the final acquisition meeting. Tell him the chairman of Axiom Global has taken a personal interest in his portfolio and will fly to Chicago to sign the term sheet in person. He's hosting a massive gala next Friday at the Drake Hotel, Eleanor noted. It's officially an engagement party for him and the new fiancée. But our intel says he's invited all his major investors to announce the Axiom buyout. He's planning to use the acquisition to save face and show off. Perfect, Cerise whispered. Draft the acquisition contracts. We will buy his firm. We will buy his debt. And then we will attend that party. The ensuing week was the most triumphant of Roberto Scott's life. He walked through the glass-paneled offices of Scott Financial like a conquering emperor. The divorce was finalized. His leech of an ex-wife was banished to obscurity, and his stunning young fiancée was busy planning a wedding that would make the society pages. More importantly, the financial guillotine hanging over his head had miraculously vanished. Alistair Galt sat across from Roberto in his sprawling corner office, pouring 2 glasses of high-end scotch. I have to admit, Roberto, you threaded the needle perfectly. Axiom Global? That's a white whale. They're buying up everything right now. If they absorb your debt and give you the executive chair of their Midwest division, you're untouchable. Roberto smirked, swirling the amber liquid. It's all about projecting strength, Alistair. You never let them see you bleed. Axiom's acquisition team has been rigorous, but they love my client list. Their chief operating officer, a woman named Eleanor Croft, emailed me this morning. The chairman of Axiom is flying in from Geneva specifically to sign the papers at my engagement gala. The chairman? Alistair raised an eyebrow. Nobody knows who the chairman of Axiom is. They operate entirely through proxies and blind trusts. That's a massive honor, Roberto. They must really want your firm. They want my brilliance, Roberto corrected, downing the scotch. This is what Cerise never understood. You have to take risks. You have to play with the big boys. She wanted safety. Now she's probably clipping coupons in a studio apartment, while I'm about to become a senior partner at a multi-billion-dollar fund. Across town, in the sprawling $40 million penthouse suite of the St. Regis Chicago, a property owned entirely by one of Cerise's shell companies, the real chairman of Axiom was having her own meeting. Cerise stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering expanse of Lake Michigan. She was transformed. Gone was the mousy, invisible woman from the courtroom. Her hair was styled in a sleek, powerful blowout. She wore a bespoke, emerald green suit that screamed quiet, untouchable wealth. Behind her, a team of 5 elite corporate lawyers and forensic accountants sat around a massive marble conference table, poring over the finalized dossiers. Eleanor Croft tapped her pen against a stack of documents. We have completed the due diligence on Scott Financial, Cerise. It's worse than we thought. Roberto has been commingling client funds to cover his commercial real estate margins. It's not just incompetence, it borders on wire fraud. The firm's true valuation is negative $12 million. He's desperate, Cerise murmured, not turning away from the window. He thinks Axiom's offer of $20 million is his salvation. We've structured the acquisition contract exactly as you requested. Her lead counsel, a sharp-eyed man named David Scott, no relation, explained. The contract he is so eager to sign is a Trojan horse. He thinks he is selling the firm and securing a multi-million-dollar golden parachute. In reality, buried in the covenants he won't read because of his arrogance, he is personally guaranteeing the firm's toxic debt using his own private assets, his house, his cars, his remaining stock options as collateral to Axiom. Once he signs, Axiom owns him. Completely. Cerise finally turned around, walking over to the table. She picked up the heavy, gold-embossed folder containing the term sheet. He won't read it. He trusts his lawyers, and his lawyers trust the summary sheet we provided. Roberto's fatal flaw has always been his ego. He believes he is the smartest man in every room. He believes Axiom wants him so badly they wouldn't dare hide traps in the fine print. There is one other detail, Eleanor said, a tight smile on her face. The guest list for the engagement gala. Roberto has invited his entire social and professional circle. He has also invited the press. He intends to use the signing ceremony with the chairman of Axiom as a PR stunt to launch his new public image with his fiancée. Cerise's eyes turned cold. She remembered the laughter in the courtroom. She remembered the mocking giggles of Chloe Kensington and the condescending sneer of Alistair Galt. They had humiliated her publicly, believing she was entirely powerless. "Let him have his press," Cerise said softly, her voice carrying an absolute, chilling authority. "Let him gather every person he wants to impress in one room. Ensure the contracts are printed on our official letterhead. I will attend the gala personally." Eleanor looked up, her eyes widening slightly. "You are going to reveal yourself? You've spent 5 years maintaining perfect anonymity." "I am the sole owner of Axiom Global. My anonymity served its purpose while I was legally tied to a financial parasite," Cerise replied, picking up a gold Mont Blanc pen and signing the preliminary approval form. "Now, the liability is gone. Roberto signed the absolute waiver. I am free to exist, and it is time Roberto Scott meets the architect of his own destruction." The trap was fully set. The bait had been taken. All that remained was the closing of the jaws. The Gold Coast room at the Drake Hotel was a masterclass in aggressive, desperate opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over ice sculptures carved into the shape of the Chicago skyline. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar and flutes of vintage Dom Perignon. The room hummed with the electric chatter of Chicago's financial elite, local politicians, and a smattering of reporters from the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg who had caught wind of the massive impending acquisition. At the center of it all stood Roberto Scott, the undisputed king of the evening. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo by Brioni, a vintage Patek Philippe Nautilus gleaming on his wrist, a watch he had financed with a high-interest personal loan just 3 days prior. Beside him, Chloe Kensington was a vision in a sweeping, backless Oscar de la Renta gown. Around her neck sat a heavy Cartier diamond collar that, unbeknownst to her, was currently the subject of a very tense conversation between Roberto and his credit card issuer. But tonight, none of that mattered to Roberto. Tonight was his coronation. "The ink will be dry before midnight, Harrison," Roberto boasted, swirling his champagne as he spoke to Harrison Gable, one of Scott Financial's oldest and most skeptical investors. Axiom Global is coming in hot. They recognize the underlying value of my portfolio. This buyout isn't just a rescue, it's a strategic partnership. I'll be heading their entire Midwest operational arm. Harrison Gable, a shrewd septuagenarian with a nose for bad debt, raised a bushy eyebrow. Axiom is a predator, Roberto. They don't partner, they devour. And no one has ever met their chairman. Are you absolutely certain you know what you're signing? Harrison, please, Alistair Galt interjected, materializing beside Roberto with a smug grin. I've reviewed the term sheets myself. Axiom is assuming the debt and paying a $20 million premium for the client list. Roberto is walking away with an 8-figure executive parachute. It's bulletproof. The chairman flying in from Geneva is just ceremonial. A photo op. Chloe giggled, leaning into Roberto's arm. We're going to be spending our honeymoon in the Maldives on Axiom's dime. It's exactly what Roberto deserves after shedding that awful dead weight last week. She didn't mention Cerise by name, but Alistair chuckled knowingly. The divorce was still a fresh, highly amusing victory for them. Outside, the brutal Chicago wind whipped off Lake Michigan, but inside the temperature-controlled cabin of a heavily armored Mercedes Maybach Pullman, the atmosphere was perfectly still. Cerise Delgado sat in the spacious rear cabin, bathed in the soft glow of the ambient lighting. She was no longer the woman who had accepted a $50,000 check in a faded trench coat. Tonight, she was the apex beneficiary. She wore a sharply structured, blood-red Alexander McQueen pantsuit that cut a terrifyingly elegant silhouette. Around her neck rested a simple, yet impossibly rare, flawless blue diamond pendant from Harry Winston, a piece worth more than Roberto's entire fictional valuation of his company. Eleanor Croft sat across from her, adjusting a sleek earpiece. Our advance team is in position, Cerise. The private signing table has been set up at the front of the ballroom, right next to the podium. The press is assembled. Roberto has taken the bait completely. He is practically vibrating with excitement. Cerise looked down at the heavy leather folio resting on her lap. Inside was the final acquisition contract. It was a masterpiece of legal destruction. Buried within the labyrinthine clauses, cross-referenced with Delaware corporate law and Swiss banking statutes, was a personal guarantee. By signing the document, Roberto was not selling his company for a profit. He was legally acknowledging his fraudulent commingling of funds and transferring personal liability for all of Scott Financial's toxic debt directly to himself, pledging his house, cars, and future earnings as collateral to Axiom. He really believes they are paying him $20 million, Cerise asked, a quiet, almost melancholic tone in her voice. She wasn't sad for him. She was simply marveling at the sheer depth of his delusion. His ego demands it, Eleanor replied smoothly. Alistair Galt only read the executive summary we provided. He skimmed the covenants. They are both blinded by greed and the desire to show off tonight. The hotel security has been instructed to let our detail take point on the floor. Cerise closed the folio and handed it to Eleanor. She looked out the window as the Maybach pulled into the VIP portico of the Drake. Paparazzi flashes began to strobe against the tinted glass. They didn't know who was in the car, but the sheer presence of the vehicle and the 3 black SUVs trailing it signaled absolute power. "Let's go," Cerise said, her green eyes hardening into chips of emerald ice. "It's time to sign the papers." Inside the ballroom, a hush fell over the crowd near the entrance as 4 men in dark, tailored suits with earpieces stepped through the heavy oak doors, swiftly creating a perimeter. The chattering elite of Chicago instinctively parted, sensing the arrival of apex predators. Roberto's eyes lit up. He straightened his Brioni tuxedo and handed his champagne flute to a passing waiter. "This is it," he whispered to Chloe and Alistair. "The Axiom team is here. Get the photographer ready." Eleanor Croft entered first. She looked formidable in a stark black gown, carrying the leather folio like an executioner's axe. Roberto stepped forward to greet her, extending a perfectly manicured hand with a dazzling, practiced smile. "Ms. Croft, welcome to Chicago. I must say, the setup is spectacular, don't you think?" Roberto beamed. "Is the chairman close behind?" "The chairman is here, Mr. Scott," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a chillingly flat affect. She did not take his hand. Instead, she stepped aside, gesturing to the open doorway. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as a figure stepped across the threshold. The blood-red Alexander McQueen suit caught the light like a flare. The flawless blue diamond at her throat flashed with arrogant brilliance. Her posture was uncompromising, her gait slow, deliberate, and entirely unafraid. Alistair Galt's arrogant smirk froze, slowly morphing into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. Chloe Kensington's jaw dropped slightly, her eyes darting from the stunning woman to Roberto, trying to compute what she was seeing. Roberto Scott stopped breathing. The color drained from his face so fast, he looked as though he might faint. He blinked hard, once, twice, expecting the hallucination to vanish. But she didn't. It was Cerise. The quiet, mousy woman he had discarded like trash. The woman he had mocked in a courtroom just 1 week ago. But the woman walking toward him now possessed a terrifying gravity. The room instinctively deferred to her, the billionaire investors and elite power brokers parting like the Red Sea to let her pass. For a few seconds, Roberto's brain short-circuited. His massive ego violently rejected the reality standing in front of him. He defaulted to the only dynamic he knew, control and contempt. His shock rapidly, violently curdled into rage. He lunged forward, his face flushing a deep, ugly crimson. "What the hell is this?" Roberto snarled, his voice carrying over the soft jazz playing in the background. Heads began to turn. "Cerise? What are you doing here? Did you spend your entire settlement check on that suit just to crash my party?" He turned wildly to Eleanor. "Miss Croft, this is a mistake. This woman is my ex-wife. She has a history of instability. She's obsessed. Security. Get security over here immediately." Two of the imposing men with earpieces immediately stepped in front of Cerise, forming a physical wall between her and Roberto. Roberto recoiled, shocked that the Axiom security detail was protecting the crazy ex-wife instead of him. Cerise didn't flinch. She gently tapped the shoulder of the guard in front of her, signaling him to step aside. She stepped into Roberto's personal space. She didn't have to raise her voice. The absolute silence that had descended upon the room carried her words perfectly. "I am not crashing your party, Roberto," Cerise said, her voice smooth, icy, and devoid of any emotion. "And I highly recommend you lower your voice before you embarrass yourself further in front of your investors." Chloe marched forward, her face contorted in an ugly sneer. "Listen here, you pathetic stalker. You don't belong here. You lost. Roberto is moving on to bigger things. Now get out before we have you arrested for trespassing." "Chloe, shut up," a harsh, trembling voice hissed. It was Alistair Galt. The high-priced bulldog attorney was staring at Cerise, his eyes wide with a dawning, catastrophic realization. His gaze dropped from Cerise's face to the heavy leather folio in Eleanor Croft's hands, which bore the gold-embossed logo of Axiom Global Partners. Alistair's mind raced back to the courtroom. The absolute waiver. The clean break. Cerise, insisting on waiving all undisclosed assets. "Alistair, tell them to throw her out," Roberto demanded, pointing a shaking finger at Cerise. Eleanor Croft stepped forward, her voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "Mr. Scott, you will lower your hand. You will speak with respect, and you will address her by her proper title." Roberto looked at Eleanor, genuinely bewildered. "Her title? She's an unemployed housewife." "No, Roberto," Cerise said softly, stepping up to the polished mahogany signing table that had been set up for the ceremony. She placed her hands flat on the wood, commanding the attention of every reporter, investor, and guest in the room. "I am the apex beneficiary of the Blackwood estate," Cerise announced, her voice echoing in the dead-silent ballroom. "I am the majority shareholder of Axiom Global Partners, and as of 5 minutes ago, when my board formally approved the final drafts—" She smiled, a terrifying, predatory curve of her lips. "I am the chairman who is here to acquire the pathetic, bankrupt remains of your life." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Camera flashes exploded, blinding white light capturing the exact moment Roberto Scott's entire world shattered into dust. Alistair Galt staggered backward, his hand flying to his mouth. "Oh my God," he whispered to himself, the legal implications hitting him like a freight train. "The waiver. We signed away everything. We handed her immunity." Roberto stared at Cerise, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. You're the chairman? That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money. You drove a Honda." "I drove a Honda because it kept you blind, Roberto," Cerise replied coldly. "You were so obsessed with projecting wealth that you never bothered to look for the real thing right under your nose. You thought I was weak because I didn't scream when you brought Chloe into our bed. I didn't scream because I was busy." She gestured to Eleanor, who unclasped the folio and laid the thick stack of contracts on the table, placing the gold Mont Blanc pen beside it. "I was busy building an empire," Cerise continued, her eyes locking onto Roberto's terrified face. "And I was busy letting you dig your own grave. Now, Mr. Scott, the press is waiting. Your investors are waiting. Shall we discuss the terms of your surrender?" The Gold Coast room, previously buzzing with the sound of clinking crystal and polite laughter, was now as silent as a mausoleum. The cameras from the financial press corps had stopped flashing, their operators suddenly realizing they were not documenting a corporate merger, but a live execution. Roberto Scott stood paralyzed. The absolute certainty he had carried into the room just minutes ago had evaporated, replaced by a cold, suffocating terror. He looked at the thick stack of papers on the mahogany table, then at Cerise's impassive face. "This is a joke," Roberto stammered, his voice cracking. He looked around the room, desperate for someone to laugh, to break the tension. "Alistair, tell them this is illegal. She can't do this. It's a conflict of interest." Alistair Galt, normally a shark in the courtroom, looked physically ill. He stepped forward, his perfectly polished shoes suddenly feeling very heavy. "Cerise, Ms. Delgado, if you are indeed the chairman of Axiom, then you negotiated this acquisition under false pretenses. We will invalidate the term sheet in court. This is corporate sabotage." Eleanor Croft didn't even blink. She pulled a single sheet of paper from a secondary folder and handed it directly to Harrison Gable, the elder statesman of Roberto's investors, who was standing just a few feet away. "Mr. Gable," Eleanor said crisply, "as the largest minority stakeholder in Scott Financial, you have a right to see the results of our due diligence audit, specifically page 4, detailing the illicit transfer of $7.2 million from the primary client escrow accounts into Mr. Scott's personal margin accounts over the last 18 months. Harrison Gable snatched the paper. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the heavily documented ledger. The old man's face turned a mottled, furious purple. He looked up, glaring daggers at Roberto. "You stole from the escrow?" Harrison bellowed, his voice echoing off the chandeliers. "You told me the commercial real estate losses were isolated. You leveraged our retirement funds to cover your personal bad bets?" "Harrison, wait, I can explain," Roberto pleaded, holding his hands up. "It was a temporary liquidity issue. The Axiom buyout was going to backfill the accounts before anyone noticed. That's why I need this deal." "There is no deal, Roberto," Cerise stated, her voice cutting through his panic like a whip. "There never was. Axiom Global does not acquire bankrupt, fraudulent firms. We acquire their debt, and then we liquidate them." Cerise leaned over the table, tapping the gold Montblanc pen against the signature line. "The contract in front of you is not an acquisition. It is a confession of judgment and a total asset forfeiture agreement. By signing this, you admit to the co-mingling of funds. You forfeit your shares in Scott Financial to Axiom to cover the stolen escrow money. Furthermore, because the firm's debts exceed its valuation, you are signing a personal guarantee. You are pledging your Winnetka home, your vehicles, your remaining personal accounts, and your future wages to Axiom Global Partners." Chloe Kensington finally found her voice. She grabbed Roberto's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his Brioni tuxedo sleeve. "Roberto, what is she talking about? Tell her she's lying. Tell her we're getting the 20 million. Roberto looked at his young fiancée, the woman he had abandoned his marriage for, the woman who had laughed at Cerise in the courtroom. His face was slick with cold sweat. He had no answer. "He doesn't have a dime, Chloe," Cerise said, addressing the younger woman for the first time. She didn't sound angry. She sounded almost bored. "The 3-carat ring on your finger. It's financed on a high-interest credit card that is currently 60 days past due. The St. Bart's vacation you took last month? Paid for with money he stole from Mr. Gable's pension fund. Roberto is not a millionaire. He is a criminal who is roughly $12 million in debt." Chloe physically recoiled, dropping Roberto's arm as if it had caught fire. She looked at the ring on her finger, then up at the furious faces of the investors surrounding them. The illusion of her glittering new life shattered in an instant. Without a word to Roberto, she turned on her heel, her Oscar de la Renta gown swishing as she practically sprinted toward the exit, pushing past the security detail and disappearing into the lobby. Roberto didn't even try to stop her. He was trapped. He looked at Alistair, his eyes begging for a lifeline. "Don't sign it, Roberto," Alistair whispered urgently, stepping close. "If you sign that, you are legally destitute. You will be walking out of here with nothing but the clothes on your back. We fight it in court." "If we fight it in court, Mr. Galt," Eleanor Croft interrupted smoothly, "my team will immediately forward the unredacted forensic audit to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Chicago field office of the FBI. Wire fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying corporate documents carry a federal mandatory minimum of 15 years. We have the paper trail. It is airtight." Cerise stood up straight, her emerald green eyes locking onto Roberto's terrified gaze. "You have 2 choices, Roberto," Cerise said, her voice echoing in the absolute silence of the ballroom. "You can refuse to sign. If you do, the FBI will arrest you before you can even make it to the parking garage. You will go to federal prison, and I will seize your assets in civil court anyway. Or you can pick up that pen. You can sign over everything you own to me right now. I will make the investors whole, I will bury the audit, and you will walk out of here a completely penniless but free man." The cruelty of the trap was absolute. It was the exact same ultimatum Roberto had given her in the divorce, magnified 1,000 times over. Take the nothing I am offering you, or be completely destroyed. Roberto's hands shook violently. He looked at the faces of his peers, his investors, the reporters. There was no pity, only disgust and shock. He had spent his entire life building a facade of untouchable superiority, and Cerise had stripped him naked in front of the entire city. Slowly, agonizingly, Roberto reached for the gold Mont Blanc pen. "Roberto." "No," Alistair muttered, stepping back, realizing his own career was likely over for failing to conduct basic due diligence on Axiom. Roberto didn't listen. A tear of pure, humiliating defeat leaked from his eye and splashed onto the thick parchment. With a violently trembling hand, he signed his name on the dotted line, legally signing away his home, his cars, his firm, and his future to the woman he had mocked just a week prior. The second the gold Mont Blanc pen lifted from the thick, textured parchment, the faint scratching sound ceased, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt suffocating. Eleanor Croft seamlessly reached forward, her gloved fingers sliding the signed contract back into the heavy leather folio. The sharp, metallic snap of the folio's clasp, echoing across the Gold Coast room, was as final and devastating as a judge's gavel. "Thank you, Mr. Scott," Eleanor said, her voice dropping its polite veneer to reveal the chilling efficiency of a corporate executioner. "The receivership begins tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp. Axiom security personnel will be waiting at your Winnetka residence to supervise your packing. You are permitted to take 2 suitcases of personal clothing and strictly sentimental items, photographs, letters, things of that nature. The vehicles, the art collections, the designer furnishings, and the contents of the home's safe belong to us. I suggest you use the remainder of this evening to arrange alternative lodging." Roberto looked like a hollowed-out shell of a man. His shoulders slumped forward, the arrogant, king-of-the-world posture he had carried for years entirely broken. He didn't look up at Eleanor. He didn't look at the whispering crowd of investors. He just stared blankly at the polished mahogany table where his empire had officially evaporated. The bespoke Brioni tuxedo that had looked so impeccably tailored just 20 minutes ago now seemed to hang off him like a borrowed shroud. Cerise stood a few feet away, smoothly adjusting the sharp lapels of her blood-red Alexander McQueen suit. She looked down at the man who had lied to her for years, cheated on her in their own home, and tried to leave her utterly destitute in a sterile Cook County courtroom. She waited for a surge of vindictive joy, or perhaps a lingering pang of sorrow for the man she had once loved. But as she studied his trembling hands and pale, sweaty face, she felt nothing of the sort. There was no fiery rage left. There was only the clean, absolute satisfaction of a ledger perfectly, mathematically balanced. Slowly, Cerise turned away from the wreckage of her former husband. She faced the crowd of stunned investors, politicians and reporters who had been invited to witness a coronation and instead found themselves attending an execution. The massive ice sculptures dripped softly in the background, a countdown clock to the end of the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cerise announced, her voice calm, resonant and carrying an unshakable authority. "Effective immediately, Scott Financial Partners is a wholly owned subsidiary of Axiom Global." She met the eyes of the men and women who had entrusted their wealth to Roberto. Some looked terrified, unsure if the ruthless chairman of Axiom was about to liquidate their life savings along with Roberto's career. Cerise's gaze landed specifically on Harrison Gable, the elder statesman who had been the first to realize the depth of Roberto's betrayal. "My transition team will be reaching out to all stakeholders individually tomorrow morning by 8 o'clock. We have already initiated the necessary capital transfers to ensure that all stolen escrow funds are fully restored, with interest. Axiom protects its investments, and we do not tolerate fraud within our subsidiaries. Your portfolios are secure." A low, collective murmur of profound relief rippled through the gathered elite. Shoulders dropped, tense jaws relaxed. Harrison Gable, a man known for his ruthless standards and unapologetic skepticism, slowly removed his reading glasses. He looked at Cerise, not as an ex-wife seeking petty revenge, but as a formidable titan of industry who had just saved his fund from absolute ruin. The old man offered a stiff, deeply respectful nod. Cerise tipped her chin in silent acknowledgement. "Good evening," Cerise said simply, addressing the room one final time. She turned and walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. The crowd parted for her once more, instinctively stepping back to give her a wide berth. The cameras of the financial press remained lowered. No one dared to break the solemnity of her exit with the flash of a bulb. The silence wasn't born of the shock and confusion that had marked her entrance. It was born of profound respect and genuine fear. Her elite security detail fell into a tight, flawless formation around her and Eleanor, escorting them through the heavy oak doors, across the opulent, glittering lobby of the Drake, and out into the biting, freezing air of the Chicago night. The brutal wind whipped off Lake Michigan, biting at her cheeks, but Cerise welcomed the sting. It felt like a baptism. As she settled back into the plush, heated leather seats of the heavily armored Mercedes Maybach, the chauffeur immediately pulled away from the curb, leaving the flashing lights of the hotel and the shattered remnants of Roberto Scott far behind in the rear-view mirror. Inside the serene, temperature-controlled cabin, Eleanor let out a long, slow breath, a rare, genuine smile crossing her normally severe features. She opened a hidden compartment and poured 2 crystal glasses of sparkling water, handing one to Cerise. "That was flawlessly executed, Cerise," Eleanor murmured, the adrenaline of the public confrontation finally settling. The look on his face when he realized the legal trap he had sprung on himself. He truly believed he had outsmarted you by demanding absolute immunity in the divorce. Cerise looked out the tinted window at the passing city lights, watching them blur into streaks of gold and white against the dark waters of the lake. She reached up, her fingers lightly brushing the cold, flawless blue diamond resting at her throat. "He built his own cage, Eleanor," Cerise said softly, the reflection of the city lights catching in her emerald eyes. "I just locked the door from the outside. What is the current status of the Winnetka house?" Eleanor tapped the screen of her encrypted tablet, pulling up the real estate division's active dashboard. "The deed transfer is complete. It will be officially listed for sale by Tuesday morning. The market is highly favorable in that zip code right now. We should recoup approximately $3 million after paying off the secondary and tertiary mortgages Roberto took out to fund his lifestyle. As you know, it's pocket change for Axiom's overall quarterly margins." "It is," Cerise agreed, remembering the vast, echoing halls of the Winnetka house. She remembered the nights she had spent alone in the guest bedroom, listening to Roberto's sports car pull into the driveway at 3 in the morning, smelling another woman's perfume on his collar the next day. The house had been a monument to his ego, a beautiful, hollow prison. "Take the entire proceeds from the sale of the house," Cerise instructed, her voice steady and resolute. "I want you to establish a permanent, fully endowed scholarship and housing fund, specifically for women who are trying to escape financial abuse in domestic disputes. Provide them with the legal counsel and the capital they need to rebuild their lives without fear." Eleanor paused, her fingers hovering over the tablet keyboard. She looked up at Cerise, a profound respect softening her sharp gaze. "And the name of the foundation?" Name it the Blackwood Foundation, Cerise replied, honoring the grandfather whose hidden, brilliant legacy had given her the ultimate weapon to free herself. Eleanor nodded firmly, typing the permanent directive into the Axiom corporate system. Consider it done, Chairman. The legal framework will be drafted by Monday morning. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before asking the final question. And what about Roberto? Do you want us to monitor his bankruptcy proceedings? Cerise finally turned her gaze away from the window, leaning back into the deep, quiet comfort of the Maybach's leather seat. The mousy, invisible housewife who had accepted a $50,000 check in a faded beige trench coat was gone, entirely eradicated from existence. In her place sat the apex beneficiary, an untouchable force of nature who had just orchestrated the most spectacular and ruthless financial checkmate of the decade. No, Cerise said, her voice slipping into a calm, undisturbed silence that felt like total, absolute freedom. Roberto is no longer my concern. He wanted a clean break. He finally got one. The scales of justice are rarely balanced in a courtroom. They are balanced in the shadows, where patience and intellect outmaneuver arrogance and greed. Roberto Scott believed wealth was a weapon used to bludgeon the weak, mistaking Cerise's silence for surrender and her grace for stupidity. When he and his cronies laughed at her in that stale Cook County courtroom, they celebrated a false victory, completely blind to the fact that they had just signed their own financial death warrants. Cerise Delgado didn't just survive her husband's betrayal, she weaponized it. She proved that true power doesn't need to shout, boast, or belittle. True power waits. By the time the laughter finally died down, the penniless ex-wife had claimed the board, taken the king, and walked away entirely untouchable, leaving a shattered man to sweep up the ashes of his own monstrous ego.